Hi, and welcome to this special behind the scenes chat looking at a Highland Song recorded for Ludo Narracon 24. I'm John Ingold, I'm the narrative director of Inkle.
And I'm Joseph Humfrey, and I am also co-founder of Inkle, and I was director of A Highland Song.
Yeah, when we try to describe our job titles, it gets confusing because I'm like narrative and Joe is like everything that is not narrative, but kind of narrative as well, because we always talk about narrative stuff, don't we? Because we're kind of a narrative focused
Yeah,
studio.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
if we're talking about Highland, where did that project come from? What's the narrative behind Highland? Where did it start from, Joe?
So I grew up in Scotland, and I love the landscapes there. I love the Highlands. I love walking in the Highlands, and so it was sort of like a personal dream of mine, I suppose, that we would one day make a game that's set in that beautiful Scottish landscape. Um, and so, yeah, that's the basic instigating idea behind the game. But it took a bunch of stuff to really to come together to turn that into kind of partial ideas to coalesce into something that was more substantial. So, for example, like my mum once gave me a book about Scottish bothies, which are these kind of Highland shelters, which anyone can use, and that you might find if you play a Highland song as well. So, because we put them in, and they're sort of like these refuges that maybe used to be cottages that used to be scattered around in the Scottish Highlands, and now they've been turned into these kind of shelters that walkers can use. Anyone's free to come and stay.
It's kind
Yeah.
of classic game designer brain, isn't it? That you read a book about the beautiful Scottish Highlands and think, oh, that's like a bonfire in Dark Souls. I can use that. Like, we're broken on some fundamental level.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I always did that as a teenager, actually, as a young adult. I think I was always looking around, and like I would look at trees and I'd be like, oh, I wonder if I could come up with an algorithm to generate trees, and that's actually what I did for a school project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember Sean Murray, the No Man's Sky guy, saying once in a talk that now when he looks at cliff tops, he thinks, oh, yeah, that's this algorithm and that's that algorithm in the landscape there. That's like, yeah, no, it's the real world, actually, mate. But I can see how it happens. So, so you're inspired by the landscape to make
hmm
this game.
hmm
What other things came together? What else was important to you there?
So I think a few years ago, I'd never listened to this before, but there was a specific music genre, that this kind of Highland folk music, that I think when I was a teenager, I didn't really like Scottish folk music because it reminded me of kind of Scottish country dancing, which is something that all Scottish kids have to do at school, and it's kind of this very old-fashioned style of dancing that I suppose you could. It's kind of similar if you're from the US. It's kind of maybe similar to line dancing or something like that. But then more recently, I discovered that there's this more modern, lively take on the genre, and with these incredible bands like Talisk and Fourth Moon, who are in the game, that's just completely a world apart from that kind of traditional old-fashioned style that I just absolutely fell in love with. And I think, John, you did as well
Yeah,
independently.
there was quite a coincidence there, wasn't there? Like
hmm
I went to a performance in a local park with my family, and it
hmm
was just some live music. We didn't really choose it very carefully, and then we were sat
hmm
listening to this thing. And you know that thing when you're sort of really focusing on something else, and there's some music playing, and then very slowly you start to go, wait, what? Hang on, is it just me, or is this actually genuinely incredible? Am I just in the right mood for
hmm
this, or is
hmm
this actually
hmm
one of the best things I've ever heard ever? And it was a band called Emar, which is it gets quite complicated, doesn't it? Emar is run by the same guy who founded Talisk and founded Fourth Moon, and we didn't actually
hmm
use Emar in the game, although we considered it.
hmm
But that was the first band that I heard. I remember you were, I think, already sketching out ideas for a Highland song, and we knew
Yeah.
that it was going to have this musical component. And I said,
hmm
"Oh, we should use this band Emar," and you were like, "Wait, have you heard of Emar as well?" I think there was a
hmm
real kind of, "Oh, well,
Yeah.
we better do that since we've both heard of it." And then We took about a year to try other things and then came back to the idea.
Yeah,
So how strong was the musical component going to be in the original prototype?
So early on, I was thinking we would definitely have that kind of Scottish music component, but initially I wasn't really thinking of it as a fully rhythm component that would be integrated into the gameplay. I was originally thinking that that this idea of having mountains that were separated by valleys that maybe you would run through was quite an early idea, but that idea of adding genuine rhythm gameplay only came a little bit later, and I think you encouraged me, actually, that you said if we're going to use this music tool. I remember the specific spot on the street, and I remember where we were when you suggested it, but I think I believe you.
The weird thing about this is that this is a real genuine behind the scenes chat, in that neither of us actually know how A Highland Song came to be, right? Because my memory of it is that you were working on this prototype and I was doing, I can't remember what I was working. I was working on one of our other games at the time, and I wasn't paying much attention. So you'd show these prototypes and I'd be like, yeah, okay, whatever. I'm thinking about this right now. And so the first time I noticed it was, the first time I remember seeing it was when you were showing it to Tom Cale, who used to work at Ingold, and did some of the early work on the game, and you were bouncing over stones, and it was all debug textures, and you were bouncing over stones, and you were complaining that rhythm gameplay was incredibly difficult to program, and because of the timing, right? It's the timing issues you were kind of grappling with. And I remember sitting there thinking, why are we doing another genre again? But I didn't say it because it was your game. But yeah.
So do you remember the first kind of thoughts that you started to have as kind of your role as narrative designer? Like, what were your first initial thoughts about what the story arc might be? Or...
I do. I remember, because I remember you saying, okay, this is we kind of split it up, and you said, I'll handle the design, and you just kind of give us the narrative to kind of power the game. And I was like, okay, that's a great split. That's really clear. We can work with that. So it's a world where you're on your own in the Highlands, and there's nobody there, and there's not really any things there either, because walking is about, it's about A to B, but there's not that much that happens in the middle of a good walk. And thinking, I can't do this. I don't know what to do. So I remember my early pitches were all like, okay, it's World War II. It's the 39 steps. You've got to deliver secret documents to someone. And you'd be like, no, I don't really feel like that captures the spirit I'm going for. And I'd be like, oh, God damn you. I need something. So I can't remember when exactly I made my peace with that and started thinking, okay, what stories can we actually tell in this environment? And this idea of a lone character going through her feelings and her memories as she walks. I think it came from a book, actually. I was reading a book called The Songlines, which is a kind of bit of popular anthropology from the 70s by a guy called Bruce Chapman, who's talking about Australian Aborigines and the way that they tell songs and tell stories to help them remember routes through the bush because they don't use maps. And it's an amazing book and an amazing idea. I'm not sure it's very well respected academically, but whatever, it's a great idea. And that idea of walking as a way of telling stories to yourself rather than the normal computer game thing where you go out into the world and there's a guy with an exclamation mark above his head and you go and talk to him and he says, all my chickens have escaped, you must help me find my chickens, which doesn't make sense in a Highland setting. And so I started writing little fragments of backstory, just almost like taking notes, really, on what this character might be. And they're pretty much verbatim in the game now, because actually the way the game works is fragmentary and little bits coming together. But I was quite scared by the size of the landscape, because that idea of being able to go very different directions, that was there right from the beginning, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, that was... I think... I'm trying to remember how early we thought of this as basically having the same structure as 80 Days and whether we thought about it consciously. But I think it's more like it's just the inkle consciousness of like us two designing stuff together that like we our games often have a similar flavor, and it's just because it's us doing stuff that we like, and that branching nature that would basically you start in one small point and you end it in one small point, but it branches massively in the middle. I mean, that's just classic Ingold, really, and like, yeah, it's the same structure as 80 Days, but and A Highland Song is the same, and I don't know whether that's just because it's the way we do things, and I don't actually know. I don't know.
I think it's interesting for the landscape because, like, when you're in a landscape, there isn't a natural forward direction. There isn't a right way and a wrong way. There certainly isn't a linear path. If we tried to make a linear path, we would have ended up with a side scroller or something like that. And although we do have this idea of the kind of parallax layers going back into the screen, the kind of depth idea.
Yes,
that's our forward, and that's the only forward in the game, right?
Like, and actually, now you mention it, I realised that for a long time, no, I did think consciously about the structure of the game, because I remember one of the things that I used to think about as a child is if you're lost in the Scottish Highlands and you're in a country like Scotland that's like, it's not huge like the US. So I remember thinking, if I was to get lost in the Scottish Highlands, one way out, and this is a very kind of mathematical way of thinking, is that you could just walk in one particular direction consistently, and you would eventually reach the sea. And that was kind
just keep going until you fall off the map.
Well, yeah, I mean, as long as you don't walk around in circles, you're going to get somewhere. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think at one point I was thinking, what if that was literally the game? Like, you're lost in the Highlands, and the way out is to walk in one direction until you reach the sea. But that's basically a different branching structure, right? It's just kind of like, yes, it sort of has an ending that's consistent structurally speaking, because you always reach the sea. It's just it branches and never comes back together to a single point.
Yeah, I think I remember you mentioning this actually, because that idea of walking through the hills to reach the sea was definitely there quite early on in kind of the narrative thoughts. And I remember thinking, okay, you have to reach the sea. Why does anyone go to the sea? Oh, it's to play with buckets and spades. Is that going to fly? That is not going to fly. And so, like, eventually we settled on this. It's quite a classic idea, this idea of a lighthouse, and you're going towards a lighthouse, and there's a person in the lighthouse who you care about, and suddenly we have another human being in the game, and then the game starts to kind of work as a storytelling exercise. That was actually quite good, but it's quite a lovely metaphor as well, the hills and the sea, that contrast between the kind of the land and the water. I remember one of the big moments for me was we have quite a lot of water in the game, the kind of the locks and the surfaces, really nerdy, but the point where the reflections went in, because the reflections are genuinely amazing, and I don't understand how it's possible, because the little animated sprite reflects in the water and ripples.
That was definitely inspired by Kingdom, because it's very pixel art style, but they're quite famous for their water reflections. In some ways I don't know why, because it's very simple in some ways. It's like doing reflections in a pixel art game is a lot easier than doing reflections in a like GTA or something. But something about that, just kind of the mirroring, shimmering effect, even though the effect is like technically is quite straightforward, is people love it. And so
I remember being obsessed by like water effects in early games. Like when I played Ico on the PlayStation 2, I remember running in and out of puddles just a lot, because it was just delightful that these puddles existed. I think it's just that they're very responsive or something like that.
So
you really feel like you're there.
So I wrote down a load of questions for you, John, and a lot of them are less to do with... we do have a sort of a plan. But it turns out that my questions are all very general. They're less specific to A Highland Song. But I want to know the answers to them anyway. So, although specifically to this project, I was wondering if there's kind of any specific ideas that you bring from your background in interactive fiction that you used in this game. Or whether that's just always kind of under the surface in the background.
So I should back up a bit and just explain what that is. So most people who develop games get started in like mods or coding or 3D art. I got started writing text-based, parser-based fiction in the manner of Infocom, which was a thing in the 80s when I was a kid, where you typed in sentences and there was this simulated game world in the background that would kind of move the story forward if you typed a sentence the computer understood. which sounds like something that people are talking about now in the context of AI and saying this will never work, it's too unbounded. And well, they were doing it in the 80s, and yeah, it was too unbounded. Nobody knew what you could type and what would work and what didn't, and how to talk to it. But if you could figure that out, they had some really interesting, rich, simulated worlds. And I kind of often reference that stuff back in the work that we do at Inkle, although they're not really interested in that. That branching thing you were saying about the beginning and the end and the wide middle. They're actually structured much more like point-and-click adventure games. They're kind of a precursor to that. So they tend to be, you go into the world, you explore a space, there's a puzzle.
And they have rooms, right? They have like these distinct spaces. That's how they're structured,
Yeah, exactly. And you navigate between them by saying northeast, south and west in every context, whether you're in an office building or you're in the Scottish Highlands, it's always compasses. But it's it works. So it's kind of interesting. And Highland is not a lot like text adventures in many ways, because its storytelling is kind of separated from the gameplay, or it's not really separated, it's kind of layered on top. So you're doing the traversal mechanics, you're doing the platforming and the exploring, and then the narrative is kind of jumping in the gaps, except that every time you find a thing, so if you find a well or a door or a house or a thing to fiddle with in the world, and obviously there are things that you can stumble on and then kind of interact with, then it suddenly drops back into being very text gamey. There's a box in the water and it's on a rope, and you've got a little puzzle of how do you get the box in, and what's it got in it, and what's it for. And a lot of those text-based games were built around object-based puzzles, right? Picking up a tool to use a tool in a context to do a thing in the way that point-and-click adventure games do. And I remember thinking about that in the context of Highland and just thinking, well, I kind of want the player to pick up items and use them and find uses for them and pursue story threads that way. But every example I could think of, you basically solve by having a good solid knife. It's like being a Boy Scout. If you've got a decent Swiss Army knife, then you're totally fine. Swiss Army knife, Kendall mint cake, you're sorted. You can do everything. You can chop wood, you can cut things out, you can dig stuff, you can, whatever it is, you can open tin cans, whatever it is you need to do. This just one tool does everything. And that's not very interesting for a game. So like do you remember we were talking about giving her a tent at one point?
Yes.
And I think the reason we didn't do that was you get a tent and then suddenly you've got a tent. You never need another tent. And
the thing that I liked the idea of originally was like starting you with a tent and then basically taking it away within the first 24 hours.
Man, people would have been so angry. Can you imagine? Like if the wind blew your tent away, or like a bear ran in and just nicked your tent, everyone would be like, "What?"
But I guess the main thing is that like if you had an item that you could take with you that lets you sleep anywhere, the main thing is that you have to give it weaknesses, I suppose. Like I don't know, if you did give her a tent, it would have to be heavy and it would be hard work to carry. It would move slower or something, but it does mean you can sleep safely anywhere. But sometimes if there was a storm, it would get blown away. But the stupid thing, I think, that I often do as a game designer is I think too much from the point of view of like just feelings and atmosphere, because the thing that I like most about the tent is just that picture in my mind of just like it's night, there's a storm, there's a tent and it's glowing and it looks cozy. And that's not really a game design, like that's just like a feeling. But sometimes I find myself chasing feelings too much and not just designing like mechanics.
When you say it like that, I don't think it sounds like a flaw to me, to be honest. Like, if you build your mechanics in order to achieve a feeling, that's a good thing, right? As opposed to just sort of, I'm doing the numbers on my tent, and my tent is a level 7 tent, and now I want it to be a level 8 tent. A lot of games get a lot of traction from that kind of thing, but it's nice to have that glowing tent at the end of it, definitely. Yeah. But I don't know.
How do you design games that way, or like what's your starting point? Do you use like feelings? Do you use mechanics?
I'm always thinking about words. I like words and phrases and bits of character. Probably character. Like the reason I like that Moria doesn't have a tent, right, is that I feel it's a very Moira-ish thing to do, to set off without a tent and then go, oh, I could have brought a tent. Oh well, too late now. That feels like a kind of. That's her character in a nutshell. If she had a tent, if she had the right kind of boots, or like, a good jacket. Well, she has an all right jacket, I suppose. But if she had a compass, it'd be a bit
Mm.
like, oh, I don't feel as sympathetic towards Moira now because she's sort of trying properly. Whereas the fact that she's just taken a series of terrible decisions at the beginning of this game, I feel that's very important to who she is. So it's that kind of thing. Like, I think for me, what really brought the design of Highland together was when I started to think about the character of Hamish and how he plays into the character of Moira. So Moira is very open and exploratory, and she's kind of interested in the world, and she's brave, and she doesn't give up, but she doesn't really know why she's doing what she's doing. And Hamish kind of connects with that because he's full of stories and history and anecdotes, but not a lot of practical advice. He doesn't send her letters saying, like, you really want to take this path here or bring a tent. He doesn't say that. He says, oh, there was once a Roman soldier who got lost on this mountain. And so they have this thing in common, this kind of whimsical, fantastical connection, which means that they're almost like they're two halves of the same character, just separated by the hills, and so it makes sense to bring them together. And that kind of thing works for me, right? Then I have this sense of, okay, I can understand why Moira wants to go to Hamish, and I can understand why Hamish wants Moira to come to him. And I think that comes across because I think when people get to the end of the game and they finally meet this guy, he has an impact, even though he's only in the game for like 10 seconds. Also, the voice performances are just fantastic. I could rave about the voice actors all day.
Oh yeah, they were wonderful.
Yeah, they were so good. But I think for me, a lot of it is about voice. Like, I love giving voices to characters, and I quite like that, particularly in games where, if you get it right, the player is taking decisions that cause things to kind of emerge from the game or to seem to happen almost for the first time. Obviously, it's all pre-scripted, but like, it doesn't feel pre-scripted when you're playing a game. It should feel like you do something and something responds to you. You go, oh, it's alive. And that thing that's alive isn't just alive, it has a voice and it talks in its own way. And maybe it's whimsical, or maybe it's scary, or maybe it's funny, or maybe it gets confused, or random stuff. Like, there's that giant who talks always with the letter W. And I don't really remember why that just pops into my head, but I wrote it down in a notebook, and then kind of it was one of those ideas that survived all the way into the game. And it's just, that's who he is. That's this guy. We've all met weird people, and this is his weirdness. So I think I often think about game design. It's a bit like you and your tent, right? You build the mechanics in order to support the tent that we don't actually have. And like, I built the game in order to support those moments of character, like out in the wilderness that you find. And I kind of love that, actually.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think we'd ever consciously talked about this before. We talked about how, like, we don't usually build games mechanics first, but I don't think we'd ever quite realized that sort of I'm always aiming for vibes and visuals, and like, I know you're into characters and narrative, but it's interesting that we both have these kind of non-game specific things that we're chasing, and then somehow we take that as inspiration and build something around it in order to kind of chase that goal, but using game mechanics as a tool.
I wonder whether it's slightly like a programmer brain, because like both of us have slightly programmer brains, right? Even if we are artists, because when you're coding, you write lines of code, but you don't write lines of code because code is good. You write lines of code because it will achieve the result you actually want. And ideally, when the result comes out, people aren't looking at going, oh, that's a really beautifully crafted algorithm. They're just going, wow, that's great. So like, I remember when we were making Heaven's Vault, right? Just to talk about a different game briefly. And you were doing the timeline interface, and you could kind of zoom in and zoom out, and you can zoom in on individual minutes, and you can zoom out to 4,000 years. And I remember at one point you saying, I'm going to have to use doubles for this. And I was like, I don't really know what that means, but I respect you for knowing this. But then when you produce the thing in the world and people are zooming in and out, they're loving the zooming in and out, but they're not thinking, wow, I bet this uses double point precision floating numbers, or whatever the correct accumulation of words that actually is. And I feel like that's kind of, it's that thing. It's like treating almost the game mechanics as a tool for generating feeling, story, character, moments, visuals. It's like that thing in Tomb Raider, right? Where in the 90s or whatever, where you climb up your passages and do your jumping blocks and then get to a little cliff top and see a vista of the jungle, and you'd go, and like, that's what it was for, actually. It wasn't for the platforming precision. It certainly wasn't to beat the time limit or anything like that. It was to get to the jungle view. And like, that always spoke to me, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So what would you say is your favorite scene from the game?
Oh, that's really hard. That's really hard. I there are lots of scenes that I don't like very much because they didn't quite work the way that I wanted them to
Mm.
work. That's the normal thing for a writer. So it's
Mm.
much easier to criticize work and to go, well, I wish that had been better. I think my favorite. Oh no, I do know actually. My favorite thing is the voice acting. The voice acting brings it to life for me. So at the very end of your first run, Moira meets Hamish, and they play this slightly extended conversation between the two of them. There are lots of little conversations you get on replays, but that first one was just so much fun to write, to finally have these two characters in a room sparring off each other. I shouldn't really choose it because it's entirely non-interactive. It's literally a cutscene, but it was just so. Oh, it was so delightful to write.
It's funny. I think I would choose the same. Like, I don't know that like there's different parts to that scene, but I mean that literally brings tears to my eyes basically every single time I play, and like I've tested that scene so many times, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So,
but I think it doesn't. It wouldn't work if there wasn't the journey before it. Like it's somehow it matters because of all the stuff the player has gone through to get there. Like it's definitely, yeah, it works as an ending, doesn't it? Because of the effort that
it's
you
funny. You say that like I on the one hand like I do agree, but I do also think there's something about pacing, music, the exact words, something about like all of those things that a scene in isolation I find can sometimes be very moving without even needing the context. I remember there was some advert on television once that I was really shocked that it made me feel emotional, like in a sad, melancholy way. Like not very many adverts can
no,
actually
sure,
like
but Don Draper is
instill
very
this.
chuffed.
Yeah, right. But I think sometimes something about like the structure of a scene can really like make you feel something without any context, and I don't know what it is because it would be great to be able to bottle that and sprinkle it everywhere all the time.
Spray it all over the entire game. You will now feel vibes. Oh no, I'm feeling vibes.
Well, actually, I mean, there is a thing. It's called music, but
yeah. Music is
forcing people
good,
to feel things.
Yeah.
And I think it does help that track by Talisk, The Hills, is just gorgeous. Like it's sort of like cheat mode for emotions to be able to take such amazing music.
I know what you mean. The soundtrack that Lawrence Chapman did for us, so the kind of ambience music. I remember when that went into the game. We were playing the prototype version, and it was still very much blocky textures. I don't think there was very much art. A lot of the level design was still kind of very rough placeholders that we'd knocked in just to kind of generate a sense of space. And then that ambience started to play, and suddenly I was like, oh, I'm there, I get it now. And like there was definitely a period when the writing that I was doing was chasing the feeling that the music had already achieved, which is a bit sort of frustrating because you think, well, maybe the writing should come first and then the music should be sort of following along the way they do it when they score a film. But no, not at all. It was just like, I want to be as good as the music here. I was thinking actually about the question of scenes that I like. The other scene I really like is the spelunker in the cave.
That would be my second choice. Yeah. I love that.
I think
I love that whole vibe as well. Like again, I like the vibes, but like the scene going when you're approaching the spelunker and then those working off each other somehow. Like everything about that whole interaction. Yeah, I really enjoy that scene.
Yeah, it was just really. I think he was one of the first like characters that you meet that we wrote into the game, and I was still kind of, I don't know, I was still in my kind of stroppy, like resenting everything phase, which is just a part of writing that I have to go through. And it was the kind of, I was thinking, well, I can't put people in the Highlands because the thing about the Highlands, it hasn't got that many people in it. And so if you meet tons of NPCs at every corner telling you that their goats have escaped, it's going to feel very not Highlandy. It's breaking the contract with the reader. But then at some point I thought, no, look, I'm going to have to put some people in. Like, I can't possibly survive a whole game with no people in it. Like, by the end of it, you'll just think Moira is just the worst person if she doesn't get a bounce off anyone weirder than her. But I thought, well, I hadn't really decided whether it was going to fly to have other characters in the game. So I thought, fine, I'll put this guy in a cave and I'll make him the sort of person who just sits in a cave all day, because then people can't complain that the Highlands are full of people, because they're not. This guy's in a cave. He's hiding.
Yeah.
He's not really there. But that was a lot of fun to write in.
It's funny what you were saying about always feeling a bit stroppy at the start of projects, because I remember distinctly, this is not related to A Highland Song, but Heaven's Vault, actually. I remember when we were just starting on that, and I remember you complaining bitterly that you had to write so much dialogue because you're so used to writing prose. With sorcery in 80 days. And I remember you just finding it really hard work getting started and figuring out just like one kind of prototype scene for Heaven's Vault.
No, it was a real, I mean, these days I love dialogue and I'm much happier writing it than prose, but I remember that too. It felt like a real trial by fire. I think the problem with Heaven's Vault early on was that I didn't know what these characters were going to talk about, because they were just wandering along and there wasn't anything to react to, so they were just shouting insults at each other the whole time, and I was like, I can't do this for an entire game. But yeah.
But also, like, coming up with brand new IP is also extremely hard. Like the amount of creative juice it takes to create something out of nothing is incredible. Yeah,
it's a funny thing, because I remember when we did Heaven's Vault, you were the one saying, look, let's build an IP of our own. Let's give this a go. You know, let's try it. And I was very much, because previously we'd always adapted things. I was like, well, look, the problem with building an IP is if you take one decision that people just don't like, they just don't click with, then your whole game, people won't play it because they go, well, I didn't really like the way that character sat in or that detail of the world or something. It was too goofy or whatever. But now I look back on it, I'm so glad we did that, and I enjoy it, because you can, once you're building an IP, you can start to fill out all the detail of the world and take kind of interesting connected decisions. Like there was a point, I think about halfway through Highlands development, where I had this core relationship of Hamish and Moira, and then starting to think, well, okay, there ought to be other things in the world that sort of play into this somehow, but in a way that doesn't feel like everyone you're meeting is your cousin's brother's sister's twin, because that's ridiculous. And finding ways to do that and kind of stealth a narrative into that world was actually really fun. But if you're working off an adaptation, you just don't get that freedom. You kind of you have to hit the beats of the thing. And I'm not even sure that adapting anything to games is a good idea sometimes, because people will go, well, it's not as good as the source material. It doesn't follow the thing that the source material followed. Like, we got very lucky with 80 Days in that it was a source material that no one has actually ever read. So they didn't really know that we wanted a piece.
Yeah, and also because we took great creative liberties with it, like it was a really helpful kind of springboard to just generate brand new stuff from, but like to give it, grounding you in a starting point was super helpful, because you already had characters who had character, and so when you invented a brand new scene, a new city that they could visit, you could sort of imagine how these pre-existing characters might react to different situations.
Yeah. And I remember when Megna started writing it, like originally she was taking scenes from the book and then sort of saying, right, let's write this, but not from an 1850s perspective, but from a slightly more sort of thoughtful or modern or worldwide perspective. And that was a really good grounding. And then by that point, after doing a bunch of that, then we got to a position where it was kind of quick to come up with entirely new content. So if we were to go back to adaptations, is there anything that you'd want to adapt if copyright was not an issue?
Oh, that's a really good question. You go first, because I think you've got some ideas actually.
I get very hot and cold about this. Somebody recently suggested a Deep Space Nine game, and I once again went, oh yeah, space station game. I've always wanted to make a space station game. I grew up loving Babylon 5, as you know.
Yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to make. I mean, we could do maybe a series. I've always wanted to do like a Star Trek game, like like a Next Generation style rather than Deep Space Nine. Just like, I think there's enough games in the genre that everything's probably been done to death. But I always did like the idea. I guess FTL kind of maybe pioneered the idea of like. Traveling, but also having that kind of the space within the ship that you can kind of explore. But I would love to do something that was just like, yeah, you're confined to the ship. Sometimes you go out onto planets. Sometimes you have interactions within the ship. Yeah, I think that would be quite fun.
So another game about traveling, basically.
Oh yeah,
because all of our games are about traveling. I was joking about this the other day. All of our games are about traveling, apart from Overboard, which is on a boat, but isn't really per se about traveling.
Yeah, that really is just kind of like a building that happens to be moving. Like you're trapped inside a house, basically.
Yeah, you totally could have pushed your husband out of a hotel window, and it would have been much the same game. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I don't know. I wonder about doing something more actiony one day. Like, I know there's somebody else doing a James Bond game.
That recently.
Can you imagine a James Bond game? Like doing the kind of the card table banter and like doing the driving, chatting while driving, but also driving. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking the other day, like, what would a Highland Song have been like if there were just like monsters? Like, would that have made it a worse game, or would it actually have made it a better game? Like, it wouldn't have had the same tone, which is quite important for what a Highland Song is. But like having the odd hedgehog to beat over the head every few meters, like, I don't know, something to do.
So I was thinking of like monsters from Scottish mythology, which are all kind of like rah, kind of monsters that live in caves and rip your face off, rather than kind of Mario sort of cute hedgehog. Doink, doink. I guess there's room for both, right? Like, yeah, I don't know. It was funny actually when researching the mythology for that kind of aspect of Highland, because obviously there's quite a lot of history, but there's quite a lot of mythology. Like, a lot of the mythology that I could find is violent monsters. It's scary things that want to hurt you. So it's monsters that live in caves, and it's monsters that live in the sea, and monsters that live in rivers. And there are other creatures, and some of them appear in the game in stories. But most of that wasn't very useful, because I was thinking, well, if we were making The Witcher, then fine, Moira would go around with her twin blades, murdering all these creatures, and that would be a valid and reasonable profession. But like, for this teenager, what can you do apart from just run away? But then I suppose we have a running away mechanic, didn't we? We have the running where you're chasing the deer. We never had the running where you're running away from a bull. Missed opportunity, or would have been a bad idea?
Well, one thing that didn't go into the game that I always wanted to do is have midges in the game, that like swarms of Scottish flies, and that you definitely have to run away from them. I definitely have memories of running away from midges in the Scottish Highlands.
Doesn't matter how much you swing your sword at a midge, it makes no difference at all. Until you get your pickup, which is presumably a can of DDT, and you can just go at them all, and they fall out of the sky, but that's not very environmentally conscious.
But yeah, there are other things. I was just going to say, like, there were other thematic ideas that I felt like we could have done for the music runs, the rhythm runs, that like I love the idea of you drop a map and then the map gets blown away and then you have to chase it and catch the map, and then it fits in with our existing mechanics, and that would have been very elegant, I think. But it's just never quite had the time. Never quite had the time for that one.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've been talking for 40 minutes, which is quite surprising, because we started this with like, what are we going to talk about? We don't really know. So,
and you know what we've saved until the very end that we should have talked about at the beginning is that we've just released the A Highland Song Harmony update.
We've done what? We've released an update for A Highland Song.
We've released a content update. What has it got in it, John?
Oh, well, I'm so excited to tell you what's in it. But, we both do actually know, of course. So the headline feature is 5 new music tracks.
Five new music tracks, yeah.
5 new music tracks. It's a couple from Taliscan, 3 from Fourth Moon, is that right?
I think that's right, yeah.
I think that's right, yeah. Really, including one of my favourites, songs, which is Cherry Blossom, which is my favourite Fourth Moon track. So I'm very, very happy to see that in the game. And what else has it got? It's got a little bit of extra story. We added a little story thread that you can pick up near the beginning. It's not supposed to be hidden where to find it. So if you just go up on that first hill hopefully players of the game.
But you do have
before
it
will
has
see
to be
something
your
different.
second. It has to be your second run. It needs to be a new game plus.
It has to be your
is that right?
second run. That's true. Yeah. So newbie players, we don't want to mess with your tutorial. We're not crazy. So yeah, they're for replays. And lastly, one very important addition.
The landmarks feature. So
The landmarks feature.
again, it's mostly for New Game Plus, although you will be able to see it on your first run as well. Like so, when you fully discover peaks or you fully discover paths that will take you forward through the game. We have a feature where when you're on the top of a peak or when you use the look further mode, you'll see icons representing all those things to help you kind of navigate and choose your next steps.
My favorite aspect of landmark feature, that when you focus on one of these paths or peaks that's come from a map, it'll directly link to the map in your journal. So it's kind of joining up the discoveries on the map page with the world that you can see. I think it's a thing we talked about quite a lot during development. It's funny, we were really unsure as to like, was this too much information? We didn't mess with the vibe, or kind of. But
one of the nice things about
didn't it?
One of the nice things about the vibe is that, like, on your first playthrough, the view will be mostly clean, so you'll get that really nice first impression of looking over these kind of pristine hills and not knowing what they are and having to spend time discovering them and figuring them out. But then on subsequent playthroughs, you'll just, as you discover more and more, they'll kind of the landscape will fill with as almost like an encyclopedia of all of the information and the stuff that you've discovered. So when you stand on a hill, there'll be a lot more kind of little icons and stuff that you discover. So new players will still have that kind of pristine experience of seeing the hills, but then more seasoned players who've played through multiple times especially will be rewarded by showing all of the things that they've discovered. So we hope that balance works well.
I kind of feel it matches the protagonist as well. Like you start off as this kind of young, fairly naive character who doesn't know at all where she's going, and then by the end of the game you're quite you understand the hills, you know them, you know every. She says in the beginning, "I know every stone," and by the end of the game, a player who's played a lot of those replays and really put that time in does know every stone. They've learned that map. If you don't want to play it that many times, you don't have to. You'll get a perfectly good experience. But like, if you want to, this is kind of supporting that development towards Moira, the person who understands the hills in the way that she kind of is destined to, and that. I think that's really nice, bringing the kind of the visual form and the character together. So we're pretty excited to see how people take to that. And there is one other addition in the update, right? We've got the music tracks, we've got the story thread, we've got the landmark feature, and above all, crowning achievement,
2 new birds.
2 new birds, exactly.
We've got a very famous grouse that's been added. You might be able to find somewhere in the game, and there's a new type of seabird that you'll be able to find at the end of the game.
And like, as you know, cynical players might think that's not a very important addition to the game, but frankly, we rather like it. So there we go. So that's the Harmony update. It's free. It's out now. We think, now. So I think we've talked for quite a long time. Shall we say thank you and good night?
Yeah, thanks everyone for watching. It's been fun chatting, John. So thanks for joining us.
It's been very nice catching up with you, Joe. We work remotely, so we don't actually talk enough. So it's nice to do this.
We should run all our design meetings like this. Come up with our game concepts. You heard it here first, folks. We're going to make a series of Star Trek games, starting with Deep Space Nine, going on to the next generation.
Hang on, there's someone on the phone. It looks like a lawyer. I've got to go. Right, have a great Ludo Narracon, everybody. Thanks for watching, and check out the game and check out the other games, and enjoy.
Bye. See you later. Bye-bye.